Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. In this episode, we are going to react to Patterns of Evidence's The Deep Sea Debate. So if you guys like this sort of content, don't hesitate to hit the like button and subscribe. And if you guys wish to support the channel financially, I'll go ahead and leave a link to my Patreon in the description below. So without further ado, let's just dive right into this, shall we?
Another thing that troubles me about a shallow water crossing is that Moses emphasizes the depth of the sea. That's why this step is called deep sea.
And you cast their pursuers into the depths as a stone into mighty waters.
As I looked at the Song of the Sea recorded in Exodus chapter 15, Moses also mentions heaps of water that were piled up, and he calls the water the deeps in the heart of the sea.
All right. We already have a problem here in Exodus 15, and we're not even a minute in, as you can see. And that this is a song in which Moses and the people of Israel sang. It's poetry. And the previous chapter, it gives a report of the incident written in historical narrative, unlike chapter 15. Now, the event itself described in the book of Exodus did happen, but the writer here is using heightening and hyperbole, which is indicative to Hebrew poetry.
If he's writing an eyewitness account, then a shallow lake scenario doesn't seem to match these descriptions. And this wasn't the only place. The Bible has numerous references to the crossing being through deep and mighty waters. So the question then is well, is the sea that they crossed a narrow, shallow lake, or is it a deep and mighty sea?
Mm-hmm.
Because the psalmist and Isaiah, they talk about this deep and mighty sea.
Well,
all right, I'm a little late here, but before Wood starts, yeah, every single passage that is listed there was written in prose or poetry added for dramatic effect. The writer is using literary devices to illustrate the miracle, and starting with Nehemiah 9:11 here, the passage is talking about the sons of Israel after Cyrus the Great allowed them to return to their homeland to rebuild the temple. So they are weeping for their sins. So the writer is walking the Israelites through creation, through Abraham, through the patriarchs, and finally the Exodus. And in verse 9, the writer states that Yahweh cast out their pursuers, aka the Egyptians, into the depths as a stone into mighty waters. Again, this is a literary device here, a simile in other words, and heightening, which we will see all throughout the Old Testament. The account there in Exodus 15:8 is prose, whilst the rest of the passages are psalms, which the creators and producers of Patterns of Evidence here will surely agree that it is poetry. Now, I have to stress this as well again, and I cannot stress this enough, is that there is a difference in genre between chapter 14, which gives the account of written in historical narrative, and it reads like an historical account, unlike chapter 15, which is written in prose. So we'll get to more passages as the video progresses though, but I just really want to stress the difference in genre between chapter 14 and then you get the prose in chapter 15.
Well, the Bala Lake was a deep and mighty sea. It was a very large body of water. So I mean, how big does it need to be? I think it meets the requirements, you know. It needed to have a miracle in order to get the Israelites across. Yeah.
Oftentimes in the Psalms, I'm thinking of several of the Davidic Psalms where he talks about deep waters, but in the parallel line, you know that in poetry you have two parallel lines. So on the one part of the parallel, it says, the Lord brought me through deep waters, and then it says, I was in water up to my neck. So in other words, the word deep there must be in whatever is the reality in the first line must also be the reality in the parallel line.
You know something, if I was a pharaoh and I saw walls of water towering on either side, I wouldn't take my army in there at all. I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole.
Well, I think that's the one thing going for a deeper crossing is that or a crossing where there would be some water. I mean, you said, okay, if we say, what does the Bible say? It says they walked and there were walls of water on their left and walls of water on their right.
Yes. Well, the other interesting interpretation is, what does the wall mean in this context? Does it mean a protection for the Israelites? So in other words, that the Egyptian army could not reach them because the water was protecting them on left and right. That's one interpretation of it. But if you're going to have something really deep, I think if you were the commander of the Egyptian army, you wouldn't go anywhere near that.
The Bible talks about walls of...
All right, here. So before he turns the attention out to Dr. Darushi here, I find it surprising that I actually agree with Dr. Wood here. Yes, he states that the Bala Lakes are actually big enough for this miracle. They're enormous during the Late Bronze Age, which could have possibly served as the point for this miraculous event. Additionally, I'm even more surprised on Roll's position here, choosing an interpretation like that. Absolutely. If I were Pharaoh, I wouldn't take my army anywhere near that stretch of water if the water was so high like a wall on my right and left, or as a heap, as the psalmist says in Psalm 136:13. Now, you can see in both English and the Hebrew refrain of that psalm, "For his steadfast love endures forever." That is just it, though. These are psalms or songs here. These are poetic passages meant to reveal how mighty and strong Yahweh is as he triumphs over his enemies. And the parallelism alone here as well, or in Psalm 78:13, should send red flags as well, indicating to not take these passages literally. Again, this is a psalm. And the psalmist even mentions this psalm as a parable. That is Psalm 78, I think. So, yeah, just I would like to urge some caution when reading the psalms and any prose or poetry text. So,
water. In Hebrew, some people have said, well, it's not really walls of water that the Israelites walked between, but that what is the Hebrew saying when it says that the Israelites walked through this channel of water?
Sorry, I just think it's funny with when it walks through the anyway.
Well, it's the common Hebrew term for the walls of a city. This isn't picket fence language. This is something substantial that was resting there, that Israel was walking through, and then that crashed, just like the walls of Jericho, that crashed upon the armies of Egypt. So the fact that it uses language of height, the language of wall, does suggest to me that we're supposed to picture in our minds something that is intimidating, something that is imposing upon those who are walking. It should instill fear if indeed those walls were to crumble. And that's exactly what happens, and what instills deep fear into the Egyptian army, so that they say Yahweh is fighting for Israel.
I know that there is a portion of the scripture that says that it was like walls of water.
It was
to
like
them.
walls of water.
So, but the thing I'm wondering about is, how could a wind set down look like a wall of water? Because it almost gives you a feel when you look at Cecil B. DeMille and the Ten Commandments. There was a wall of water here and a wall of water here. So this doesn't look like that to me.
Well, these are our expectations that walls have to be high. It doesn't have to be high, it doesn't have to be vertical, it doesn't have to be, super spectacular. It's just very strange.
During the
Absolutely. They don't necessarily have to be high, but I'll get to that in a second. But the one thing I find fascinating here is that Tim, the producer here, uses a simile, which again is a poetic device to describe the water. But more specifically, I wanted to comment on Dr. Darushi here. Although he is correct that the word choma, used in Exodus 14:22, which is the historical report of the Exodus, is the biblical Hebrew word for wall. Additionally, it is the same word mentioned in Joshua 6 when describing the fall of the city of Jericho. However, the description of the wind blowing back the water all night and quickly returning to its pristine position at dawn seemingly supports the event of a wind setdown. Carl Drews now, who works for the National Center for Atmospheric Research, explains the event in Exodus 14:21 and it looks like a wind setdown. And he says here, what I did was use a wind. He's talking about computers and computer imagery. So he says, what I did was use a wind, sort of the strongest wind that he could use, that I thought, and mix groups of adults and children that they could walk through it. So the wind that Drews could have used here was 63-mile-an-hour winds, which would be a medium-strength tropical storm. He continues to say that the water blows on the water and it stacks it up at the other end. Now, this could be what the writer of Exodus means or states when he says the walls was on the right or the left. And Deborah Hearn here hit the nail on the head in that we have expectations when it comes to walls, and they don't necessarily have to be high. They can be small, they can be short. They don't necessarily have to be ginormous. So I think that's something we also have to look out for. We have these preconceived notions in our head, namely from the film earlier that Tim said, is that we have these images of Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, and then we apply those to history, and that's not exactly how that works. So
the night, while the wind was blowing, the Egyptians had already reached the camp of the Israelites, and God had to protect them from their arrows and spears. And so the cloud that went before them moved behind them and came between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The cloud of glory, God's cloud, actually absorbed the arrows and the spears. There's a profound lesson there that God protecting his people will actually take a bullet. It didn't deflect the arrows, it absorbed them. So sometimes God will suffer for us in order to prevent us from suffering. And although that sounds a little unusual for God to suffer, but if God has love, then he must also be able to suffer. Because if you can't suffer, you can't love. If there's no vulnerability, there is no love. So this is really, if you look at it from a romantic perspective, this is really a relationship developing between God and his people in a very intimate, a very vulnerable, and a very two-dimensional relationship. It's not only that we have to obey God, it's that God has a vested interest in his creation.
How do you reconcile?
all right. Wow, that's all I gotta say for that. That was certainly a profound explanation of the cloud and pillar that separated the mixed multitude from the Egyptians. I get the mixed multitude from Deuteronomy 7:7 if you want to know. So yeah, the Masoretic text though only says that the pillar of cloud sent the Egyptian camp into confusion. At least that's what the Masoretic text says. I'm not really sure where he gets the absorption thing from, but if someone knows where he gets that from, please do let me know in the comments below. So
Reconcile a shallow lake on the Egyptian border
my man, Dr. Hoffmeyer,
with a sea like Aqaba that actually more supports what Psalms and what Isaiah is as a tradition of a deep and mighty sea.
I think one has to be very careful when taking the poetics of the prophets or the poetics of the book of Psalms and reading literal readings back into the text of Exodus 14 and 15, let's say. So just as a principle of interpretation, I'd be very careful.
So this mighty waters, this depths, once again, is it just poetic, or was this sea a deep sea, do you think?
All right. No, we're going to let him continue here. Yes.
Even though the language is poetic, it still has to have a referent. It still has to be pointing to something. The grandiose language of deep and mighty has to have a referent in space and time. You wouldn't call, from a human perspective, a cricket mighty. And so they're talking about something. They're envisioning what happened, and they're describing it in language that you and I find very familiar. And deep and mighty waters, and down to the very foundations of the earth, That kind of language is portraying something. It's supposed to incite something, not to move us into a fantastic imaginary realm, but rather one that is concrete, one that we understand. They are declaring something about the nature of the crossing.
Then the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils.
Is it a deep sea or is it a shallow lake next to the border of Egypt?
There are different words for.
All right, here I let this go out a little bit, but Dr. Hoffmeyer, I think, is absolutely correct here in that we must be careful when reading the poetic texts like Psalms, because we would be guilty of some form of eisegesis. Now, that part he didn't say, that's me adding to it. But I find it strange that Dr. DeRushi here would use the analogy of a cricket here, in that he must understand and know that the writers of the Old Testament themselves used hyperbole and heightening poetically to illustrate a point. The point being how mighty and strong Yahweh is, and not the sea or wind that Yahweh actually commands. So it's why I kind of laughed with the analogy of the cricket, and using language in which that we would be familiar. I think one thing that I learned in grad school and everything was that this text was not written to us, but written for us. It was written to the ancient Israelites, not to us in modern society. So I think that's also something we have to take into account as well. So I'll let it continue here.
For things that are more shallow, you have a word for a wadi or a wadi. You have a word for river. The term that you consistently have for the Red Sea is Tahom, which is the same term that's used in Genesis 1 for the primeval depths, the primeval waters. So the term Tahom typically references something that's deep water, like a deep water abyss. So like in Psalm 106:9, Wayeger b'yam suf, and he rebuked the Red Sea, Wayecharav, and he cast them Bat-Hamot, into the depths.
Okay.
And so the poet is creating this poem in such a way as to emphasize the depths of the Red Sea at that point.
All right. So that might be different than a shallow lake.
Yeah, although I might say about my love for my wife, my love is deeper than the ocean, longer than the river. I might say something like that in order to give you a sense of how vast my love is for her.
So we don't know whether it's poetic or whether it's descriptive of something that was passed down as to being a deep sea.
It's both. It's definitely both. It's descriptive and it's poetic.
In chapter 4.
All right, here, before he continues, Brian Rickett is correct here in that the biblical Hebrew word used, Tahom, can and does mean depth, but it also can mean primeval ocean or flood. And in Exodus 15:5, it should be translated as floods and water. Now, he uses Psalm 106, verse 9, which, again, I should like to throw caution in that we must be careful not to take this literally, because, again, this is a psalm. That's kind of my reaction there that you guys saw, was Tim's response to Rickett on, well, we don't know if this is a shallow lake or a deep ocean. It's a psalm. So again, it's using that heightening and that hyperbole that we so commonly see throughout prose and poetry texts of the Old Testament. Now, moreover, Rickett doesn't necessarily have the correct translation here. The verb there is charav, which means to become dry and not to cast into the depths. So the passage should be translated, and he rebuked the Reed Sea, and it became dry, and he led them into the depths or into the flood waters. The subject here isn't the Egyptians, but rather the mixed multitude that later became the Israelites. Now, I did like his analogy to describe his love for his wife here, where we can use poetic language of depth to speak of how much he loves his wife. And he seemed hesitant, though, here, but he calls it a poem and the poet who wrote the text. So I did find that strange that he seemed to backtrack a little with Tim's when Tim pressed him that, well, we don't know if this is a shallow lake or a deep ocean. Throughout Psalm 106, or at least in Psalm 106, and throughout the Psalms, like Psalm 136, Psalm 78, and then you get to Psalm 106. Again, you see this heightening and hyperbole again. I cannot stress this enough, guys. This is poetry, so that's what's going on here. Now, I'll let Dr. Darushi here speak, yeah, we'll just continue here.
14, verse 13, Moses tells the people, don't fear, because it's Yahweh who is going to fight for you. Then we move down into verse 17. God himself declares, I will get glory over Pharaoh and all of his hosts, his chariots, his horsemen. It's striking to me how the biblical witness itself goes out of its way to testify the fulfillment of that passage.
This was absolutely breathtakingly spectacular. So much so that all the nations, like Rahab, for example, in Jericho, had heard about this miracle. And the Egyptians certainly knew about it. And the Amalekites, they knew about it. I think it was a big deal. And I don't think it's possible to question that everybody knew.
Well, I know that some would say that if you had a wind set-down theory, let's say, and the wind blew across a shallow body of water, because wind can only push maybe 3 or 4 feet.
I just, he's not getting it. He seems to think that the Bala Lakes were shallow waters. They were a little deeper than that. I don't like his, he seemingly just reverts back to shallow waters, as opposed to, I know what he's thinking is the Gulf of Aqaba, which is really deep water and everything. So, but the Bala Lakes themselves were deep. They were deep. So they weren't definitely deeper than the Gulf of Aqaba, which I guess is where he gets the shallow end of it. But these lakes were large enough to drown people. The Bala Lakes are definitely large enough to drown people, so.
Feet of water, that when it comes back, it would be mighty, and it would be powerful, and it would be, it would probably be maybe 9 or 12 feet tall, for example. So do you think that that's what these references are? A shallow lake in Egypt, or is it a sea?
The fact that locusts from the entire length of Egypt have to find a resting place in a body of water. The fact that an entire army, not just a small one, no, indeed the greatest army on the planet in the day, is decimated so that, it stresses in Exodus 14, not one of them was left, suggests that depth means depth. That what comes to our mind is something magnificent, something that, to talk about the foundations of the earth, what that portrays for me is a place where man does not normally go. But Israel is crossing there on dry ground, standing in awe of a God who has pushed these waters back in a way that no common wind would do, with a result that no common wave would bring. Our historical interpretation has to align with the biblical data, which points to a massive event by a God who is incomparable, who is working in history to save a people in order to set a pattern in place that culminates in the coming of his Son, where the greatest enemy, the serpent himself, is defeated. So then in Luke chapter 9, when Moses and Elijah show up on the Mount of Transfiguration, it says explicitly in the Greek text, they spoke about Jesus's exodus. Now, many translations will just use the word departure, but it's the only place in the entire New Testament where the term exodus actually shows up. And they're referring to his death, burial, and resurrection in Jerusalem. This is where Jesus will accomplish freedom from slavery for all who have been bound to sin. And it's a key element that would be missed. The miracle of Jesus' deliverance of sinners is anticipated in the Exodus itself, in this divine work that could not be accomplished by anything in nature. So it's important for us to see it as a miracle because it not only takes the Bible on its own terms and makes much of a big God who is worthy of glory, it also makes much of His Son and the work that Jesus would do in the New Testament age.
All right. Now, Dr. Derushi here says a lot, and I wanted to wait for him to finish. I definitely agree with him that the Exodus was a massive event, and that Yahweh did get His glory through the Exodus. But what makes the Exodus massive, though, that I would describe, is the timing. The salvation of the mixed multitude with their backs against the water, and finally humbling Pharaoh with this wind set down. Now, this event no doubt would have sent shockwaves across the ancient Near East, especially the territory that Egypt controlled in the Levant. Now, the Egyptians were already starting to lose their foothold over the Levant. However, defeating this army of the Egyptians would have certainly alarmed them, hence the Canaanites' knowledge of the event. I think that's how powerful this event was, even though it wasn't on a grand scale of the Ten Commandments. The fact that the Egyptian chariotry fell at the Reed Sea crossing is absolutely telling. It would have definitely been unusual to hear an Egyptian army lose to rabble, to slaves, to ex-slaves, if you will, ex-enslaved peoples, I should say. Sorry. So yeah, definitely that is the massive event, though. And you don't need a film like the Ten Commandments to describe such a massive miracle, in that it was the timing and everything. So, yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems that a lot of people have today is they're just basically saying, well, how could this have happened? It had to have been a miracle.
The way I look at it as a geographer is that you can establish reasonably that the Gulf of Aqaba was the Hebrew Yam Suf. And so you know that the sea was there. Now it's up to the pundits to decide whether they crossed one place or another. Yeah. And from my study of the sea, the only place that has slopes that could accommodate a crossing are at Nueva. And so they can complain about the depths, but they can't complain about the location of the sea. And so, as I said, you can lead people to the shore of the crossing site, and then whether they're going to believe that it could happen is their own issue.
Yeah.
When all of this happened.
All right. So, yeah, there are 3 proposed locations for the early Exodus on the Gulf of Aqaba, and I cannot help think that Ron Wyatt, of all people, led some of these people to conclude that the Exodus is at the Gulf of Aqaba. Another thing I want to mention here is that Yam Suf has also, well, I should say some people have also tried to translate Yam Suf as the Sea of the End, but it just doesn't fit the context throughout the Exodus as Sea of the End at all. It definitely has to mean Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf, because Suf is the Hebrew word for reed. So it just doesn't quite line up with the text. So, and I really cannot find another interpretation for Yam Suf other than Sea of Reeds as well. So,
and the Egyptians are washed ashore, so that there's no doubt as to what happened, because the people could have believed that the Egyptians turned around and went home. But when they washed ashore and the people saw what had happened, this incredible miracle, they were moved to sing. So Moses composed this song, and the people sang, and then Miriam composed a song, and the women danced.
But that's my point, though. They sang.
And basically they were expressing their gratitude for God's miracles. What's really interesting is that the Hebrew word is yoshir, which is future tense. And then Moses yoshir, which means will sing.
I think he means imperfect, but
and the interpretation there is that the exodus from Egypt,
he's accommodating Indo-European speakers,
because after that the Jews came to the land of Israel, they were exiled from there, the temple was destroyed, they went back a second time, built a second temple, were exiled a third time, so that the Song of Moses will serve us not only then, but also in the future, in the Messianic days, when the exile ends forever and there's no more exile of anybody, or no more suffering in the world. Then this song will be repeated and will again be sung.
All right, guys. That was actually a good conclusion. I did like that conclusion about the imperfect tense of shiri, which means to sing in Biblical Hebrew, that we will all sing the song in Exodus 15 at the end of the age. Well, guys, that concludes this installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. If you guys like this sort of content, please hit the like button and subscribe. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, guys, thank you guys for watching. Bye.